Hello there, this is James Scroft, it is 1978, and having never had any real interest in the franchise and never even seen any of the movies, after almost 20 years of making excuses, I've spent the last week or so listening to all 7 Harry Potter audiobooks and just finished the Deathly Hallows yesterday, but rather than reviewing them or giving my opinion on the overarching story beyond mentioning that the books certainly grew up with their readers, maturing from a children's story to a somewhat flawed but still deeply moving novel by the end, in this video I'll be addressing the fundamental question of why this series is certainly one of the most, if not the most popular, most beloved and most inspiring in children's/young adult fiction, spawning a multi-billion-dollar movie and merchandising franchise which appears to have been the starting gun that launched everything from the Lord of the Rings and Twilight film and merchandising franchises to the ongoing Marvel movies, creating the new paradigm in Hollywood in which the individual films themselves are essentially irrelevant because instead they are only a part of the complete universe which exists largely on the internet and in the minds of fans. In fact, the premise that the movies, books and what have you themselves are largely irrelevant is the basis of this video, because when addressing the question of why a particular work of fiction, legend, myth or even religious text is popular, beloved and inspiring, the question is not how well is it written, but rather what does it truly mean to the audience. In my previous video, Superman and What It Truly Means to Be a Hero, links down to the underbar, I explained how the legends that we create of heroes are not based in reality, but in our own need to believe that heroes exist, as well as perhaps more importantly, the need to believe that we can all choose to be heroes ourselves, and that therefore the reason why Superman is an icon who is recognised across the entire planet is not that he is super strong, has heat vision or can fly, but instead the fact that even if he were a normal human being, he would still be Superman. As a matter of fact, more so than ever, because his willingness to sacrifice himself for others without hesitation would make him even more of a hero. But ironically, the fact that Superman is so heroic, so noble and so unwaveringly good is precisely the reason why so many people sneer and jeer at the very concept of that character, because going back to what I said a moment ago, perhaps even more important than the need to believe in heroes is the need to believe that we can choose to be heroes ourselves. And when the man from Krypton sets the bar for heroism so impossibly high, it's only natural that many of us would resent him. However, this is precisely where the character of Harry Potter comes in, perhaps the defining embodiment of the mediocre dude saves the world trope, because as Dumbledore explains in one chapter of the 6th book in the series, it is the very fact that Harry is so ordinary, with no longing for wealth, immortality or power, and can feel love for others while Voldemort cannot, that makes him quote-unquote special, and Snape, Voldemort and even Harry himself explain and make clear again and again during the final 3 books in the series in particular, that right up until the final battle with Voldemort, the fact that Harry ever achieved anything or survived at all depended entirely upon the constant assistance, hard work and sacrifice of others, as well as blind, stupid luck. Indeed, I thought that Rowling was actually taking the piss at one point during the 6th book when Harry took a swig of a luck potion to ensure his success in one endeavour, when, as I say, and he admitted over and over again, blind luck was one of the only reasons why he hadn't been killed 100 times over during the previous 5 years of his life. But while speaking personally, I rolled my eyes at the absurdity of every plot contrivance which ensured that Harry always succeeded in the end. They were, I believe, at least in part, what caused the character of Harry Potter to resonate with so many people, particularly the first generation of older children and teenagers across the world who literally grew up reading the series and still adore it to this day. The fact that Harry, Ron, and perhaps to a lesser extent Hermione during the first 3 years were just like them, or at the very least were characters with whom they could truly identify. Ordinary children who, aside from the fact that Hermione was academically gifted and Harry was a natural-born Quidditch seeker, had no extraordinary talents or abilities, and, at least up until the 7th book, never genuinely sacrificed anything, the definition of heroism, but instead were merely declared to be heroes because they threw themselves into danger with no idea of what they were doing or how they would survive, and just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right help and fortune on their side, thus allowing real children and teenagers who read their adventures to believe that they could be heroes as well. But of course, that's the description of almost every hero in almost every children's story and young adult story ever written, meaning that we need to look deeper, because although so far in this video I've focused entirely on Harry fighting evil and saving the world, that only really began at the end of the 4th book in the series, demonstrating that it was built upon the foundation that Rowling had already laid, and in the end, in fact, that foundation is, I believe, what truly made Harry Potter the phenomenon which it became, because while the media is full to bursting with mediocre dudes who save the world, Rowling's genius was to tie that trope to the power fantasy of every bullied, neglected, overshadowed, or otherwise unhappy child everywhere. Although the Dursleys' abuse and neglect of Harry in the 1st book in particular was a childish parody of genuine abuse and neglect, I do not mean that as an insult, because obviously it resonated with children across the world. Through the character of Harry Potter, Rowling spoke to the Cinderella fantasy, for lack of a better term, that exists within all of us to a greater or lesser extent, but particularly in unhappy children. The dream that after suffering mistreatment at the hands of a pantomime parody of a spiteful and neglectful family, a fairy godmother, or in Harry's case, a half-giant with a huge black shaggy beard waving a flowery pink umbrella, will come to tell you that you're special and a new and much happier life is waiting for you elsewhere. But while my use of the term power fantasy in this video may be unsettling for some people, I don't mean it in any negative sense of the term, as in exploiting or dominating others. On the contrary, in fact, I use it to describe how for a decade or so Harry was entirely powerless, not magically, but in his own life, dominated, condemned, and controlled by others without recognition, hope, or even basic human decency. But then he was taken to Hogwarts, where he was independent, in other words, had power over his own life and future, where simply being himself meant that he had the power to save the world from he who must not be named. And what child in the end doesn't dream of being independent, of having power over their own life and their own decisions? As a matter of fact, I know one Harry Potter fan who, when she was 11, sat crying because Hagrid hadn't come to take her to Hogwarts, and I know for certain that she was not the only person in the world to do so. But just in case anyone thinks that I'm accusing J.K. Rowling of ripping off Cinderella, or anything else for that matter, as I mentioned before, it is the needs within us that make some stories and characters stand the test of time, meaning that they are used over and over again, not how original a story may be. And while there is now a trend of attacking tropes and formulaic storytelling, regardless of how those tropes or formulas are used, the question is always how they are used, with, in the case of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling bringing multiple tropes together to create something which, to the reader, felt entirely unique. For example, when you strip them down to the barest essentials of their characters, Dumbledore, Voldemort, and Harry Potter are Obi-Wan Kenobi, Darth Vader, and Luke Skywalker, but that doesn't necessarily mean that J.K. Rowling ripped off Star Wars any more than it means that she necessarily ripped off Matilda by Roald Dahl or The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy. After all, doing my best to summarise quickly without going into a long and boring explanation of the monomyth and the collective unconscious, there are certain stories which we as human beings have always told because we've always wanted to hear them. This is the reason why people in Malaysia created a fairy tale with striking similarities to Cinderella centuries before Europe had any contact with Southeast Asia, and people in Europe were telling the story of Cinderella centuries before the Brothers Grimm actually wrote it down. Because, as I mentioned before, the hope that someone will tell you that you're special and take you away from your abusive relatives or what have you to a new and happy life elsewhere is the dream of all unhappy children in particular, and always has been. So instead of dismissing Harry Potter as unoriginal or anything else for that matter, we need to appreciate that just as Gene Roddenberry did when he created Star Trek, Rowling created a fictional universe and characters who spoke to the deepest dreams, ideals, hopes, desires, and even fears of her audience, meaning that no different from Star Trek, Superman, or 1,000 other stalwarts of our popular culture, Harry Potter is now a part of our collective unconscious, creating ripples that will affect everyone for generations to come, even those who never read the books or watch the films for themselves. And therefore no different from Star Trek, Superman, or 1,000 other stalwarts of our popular culture, while fans and critics will continue to analyse and argue over them until the end of time, the flaws and failures of the Harry Potter books themselves, and likewise the flaws and failures of the films, are, as I said before, essentially irrelevant. The fact that the 6th book is almost nothing but filler, the absurdity of how Potter always found, was given, or otherwise came across exactly what he needed at exactly the right moments, and in the 1st book in particular suffered no permanent negative consequences, and everything all worked out as perfectly as it possibly could without being totally ridiculous even to a 10-year-old, how he could fly a broomstick magnificently on the first attempt with no training or practice, and thus became the youngest Quidditch player at Hogwarts for a century when he should have been expelled, or at the very least punished, merely because of his good genes and blind luck. The fact that Harry Potter is the centre of his fictional universe, meaning that characters and events, places and actions only ever exist in relation to him, or by extension to Ron, with Cho Chang and Cedric Diggory, to give only 2 examples, being little more than one-dimensional afterthoughts in the story, Ravenclaw House having may as well been erased from the series altogether, except at the very end of the last book when Harry needed something from it, and Quidditch existing solely as a means for Harry and later Ron to prove themselves, that although her character developed significantly in the later books, with her fight for elf rights and equality being a critical but ultimately praising allegory for social justice activism here in the real world, the way that Hermione Granger's character for the first 3 books could have been summed up as, and indeed was summed up as, a bossy, nagging know-it-all, because at that time that was how she related to Harry and Ron in the story, and therefore the sum total of her existence. The fact that Severus Snape, not Harry, was the greatest hero in the series, although Rowling did acknowledge this at the very end of the last book, and that so many other characters, particularly Neville Longbottom, who only failed to be the chosen one because Voldemort attacked Harry as a baby instead of him, were far more deserving of the title of hero than Harry Potter ever was, especially in the 7th book, when Neville was leading the resistance against Voldemort's cronies at Hogwarts and being repeatedly tortured for doing so, but we were stuck reading about Harry and Hermione prattling around and feeling depressed in a tent in the countryside for a year. And speaking of which, the way that every book in the series was dragged out over the course of an entire school year, so that during the 7th I was screaming, "Command the locket to open in Parseltongue!" But no, Harry couldn't figure that out for at least another few months for fear of ending the story before June. Like all of the flaws, problematic elements and outright absurdities in Star Trek, of which there are many, none of this means anything to the millions of children who, thanks to these books, grew up believing that yes, being ordinary made them special and could enable them to be heroes as well.